in today's gospel, Peter is upset that Jesus is telling his disciples that they need to go down to Jerusalem where he will suffer a great deal and in fact be killed. Of course, Peter is upset. Wouldn't we be upset if someone we loved told us that, let alone a beloved spiritual teacher, let alone Jesus, the Messiah? Peter says, no, this should not happen. Come on. We might be judging Peter, but it's 2,000 years later and we know the rest of the story. So it's easy for us to say, but really, Peter seems to be acting out of common sense and a feeling of love for Jesus, protection of his life, seeking a way to continue the mission. Even though Peter doesn't actually understand the mission, he does want to continue it without a great deal of suffering and death. Jesus' response to Peter was very strong. He calls him Satan. This is very different than the conversation they had last week when Jesus told Peter that he was the rock upon which he would build his church. Today, Jesus calls Peter a stumbling block. And he tells his disciples, if you want to be my followers, you need to deny yourselves and take up your cross and follow me. By the time Matthew wrote this phrase, take up your cross, it probably was a familiar phrase among the new followers of Jesus, a phrase which defined a faithful disciple as one who accepted suffering or even death as part of his path. Suffering and death? This whole idea raises challenges to our understanding of God's ways and God's love and God's will. I would suggest that a heart of this question is about the task of discernment, of discerning God's will in our lives, this very powerful art and practice of learning to discern where we are being called. Because the nature of the temptation that Jesus is rebuking Peter for is that Peter imposes his will over God's will. Jesus says, you're setting your mind on human things, this limited perspective, instead of the divine perspective, the bigger picture of the one who is calling you into the truth and the life. So what might this mean for us? How are we to discern the divine perspective in leading our life? We don't have Jesus in the flesh with us saying, come on, let's go down to Jerusalem. Okay, well, he knows, so let's go. How do we make choices about whether we should take a path that is difficult or has risk to it? This text is not telling us that the way to follow God is always the way of suffering. The text is actually saying that there is a cost to salvation, to the spiritual journey of becoming more free, more fully alive in God. There is a cost. This is not a transactional price, as if God is a being who's saying, you want something from me, you got to give me something, and I'll give you back, like it's a purchase. The cost to salvation is that in order to become what God has given us to be, is inviting us to be, we need to make space for that. You probably recall from high school physics, the natural law that two things can not occupy the same space at the same time. So our will and our desires to have things our way in ways that we feel comfortable, that takes up a lot of space. And it can prevent us from seeing and hearing or even willing to be open to God's prompting for us. Our will includes having things our way. We might say, yeah, I'll surrender to God, but I want to be comfortable with it. I want to understand how it's going to go, and I don't like surprises. But to discern God's will, we need to be open and we need to make space and be willing to surrender pride and ego. That process is a kind of death, a painful and difficult death. We need to release our control, or more truly speaking, our illusion of control. We need to be willing to surrender status, or our resistance to change. Radical change can be frightening. It's like leaping off a cliff. We can look to nature as models of following God's will fully. Plants, for example, as far as we know, don't have free will to choose or self-consciousness. So their life is a lot less complicated. So when a seed lands in the earth, its shell breaks apart. The plant is not saying, oh my gosh, look at my cell, I need some cream or something, I need some injections. It's not looking good. The shell dissolves into the earth and it becomes something new. It rises up out of the darkness, always changing form, from a shoot to a stem, to a branch, to a leaf, to a flower, ever changing. Our cost is similar to this. To open and grow into what God is calling to be is a kind of death and risk and suffering, of losing, of letting go who we're used to being, who we think we are, or who we should be, and listening to the prompting of God, leading us in a direction that might not make sense to us or feel comfortable from our human perspective. The story of Jesus Christ going into Jerusalem to be crucified is an illustration, a radical illustration of this very journey. Jesus says, "For those who want to save their life will lose it." In other words, if you try to stay who you are and don't make space for flowering in God, you miss the fullness of life. And Jesus said, "Those who lose their life for my sake will find it." That is saying, I'm willing to trust in God and learn this art of discerning where I am being drawn, where God is calling me. And I'm willing to go there no matter what, into true life, into salvation from the bonds of ignorance, into something far greater than what we can see in our human perspective. What Peter seemed to miss was the last thing that Jesus said after suffering and death. Do you remember it? He said, "On the third day, be raised." New life, beyond this small shell, beyond our human perspective. So let us go down joyfully and willingly into Jerusalem, following Jesus into the risky business and suffering of death and death of who we think we are, into the freedom of eternal life, into this timeless presence of God with us now in our hearts, inviting us to the resurrection.